Hey, welcome back to Business 150, Introduction to Management. This is now our last video in this module number 8 on the topic of organization. As you can see from the title slide, we're looking at the topic of navigating organizations, or really, what does it really look like in real life and what will you encounter in your career when we talk about things like organizational structures, what structures do particular organizations use, how do you adjust an organization when you need to make a change on behalf of the people, those kinds of things. And so as you can tell from this slide, what we're looking for is when you finish this video, that you will be able to summarize the contingency factors that influence the type of formal structure that's best for an organization. That you will be able to describe the different types of coordinating mechanisms that can be used to support the organizational structure. And finally, that you can distinguish among 5 organizational archetypes. Those being the simple structure, the machine bureaucracy, the professional bureaucracy, the divisionalized form, and an adhocracy. Those are terms which may not be familiar to you, but we hope that at the end of this video, and of course your time in the textbook, that they will become obvious forms that you can define and distinguish. So let's talk about the kinds of things that affect the choice of organizational structure. What structure that is best for an organization depends on quite a few things, actually. Because remember, the form is going to help to either make things easier and efficient, or quite frankly, difficult and work at cross purposes from how the people actually want to conduct business. And so some of the things that will influence your best choice of structure will include the size of the organization, where the organization is in terms of its natural life cycle, more on that in a slide. What is the strategy you are bringing into the marketplace? And then what is your alignment with the external environment? Remember, when we talk about strategy before, those are 2 very important matters, right? The strategy you choose, and then the choice, how that matches up with the realities of practical alignment. And finally, with the actual existing technology you have to use, not only in behalf of, for tech firms coming up with technical products, but really for the technology that will help your business move forward one way or the other. So one of the first things that will definitely impact whether or not the organizational structure that you select is effective or not is the organization's natural size. How large has your company gotten? Because the larger the size of the organization, the more people you have that need to cooperate and work together, the more structure you'll need to support multiple divisions, perhaps larger geographical span. And so obviously the larger an organization, the more crucial the appropriate selection of structure becomes. The second thing that will affect your choice of appropriate structure is where your company is in its natural life cycle. Now, that may be a concept we haven't discussed up to this point in this class, but we look at organizations as natural living structures. They're organisms with a birth, a growth, maturity, and typically a decline phase. You see here listed in the slide, it lists revival. Well, that you hope it has a revival once it's reached a maturity and decline phase. Nevertheless, organizations live and grow and morph and change and sometimes die over time. Each stage will have its own characteristic features that will make some choices of organizational structure more appropriate than others. Let's see if we can illustrate this. I've gotten this illustration off the internet, but I think it's appropriate. The life cycle of an organization. It's a little pixelated, but hopefully you can make out what it's saying. In the early stage, the birth stage of a company, then while you may have a mission statement written, in real life, what you find is the values of the organization are still really being crystallized and being cemented, because you are doing so many things at once during the birth phase, just establishing who you are, what you're about, what culture actually feels like. your direction is still forming, and you can see the rest of the bullet points there, right? You're still doing some very rudimentary foundational planning about who you are and, as they say, who you want to be when you grow up. And you're getting a bunch of people who have maybe bright, starry eyes about a vision, but you're still trying to keep them motivated towards a single path, those kinds of things, right? Whereas once you really start to begin to get traction in the marketplace, and you really are getting some success selling your product and service, well, to strangers, right, to consumers, then hopefully your organization will enter a growth phase. And growth phase companies are typically driven by values. You are going to change the world, darn it. You have really brought something to the marketplace that no one else has seen before. And that provides some very clear direction. It confirms and validates your strategy to date, and that in itself motivates you to do more strategic planning as you continue to have bright new dreams for where you're going to grow next. It's a time of trial and error learning, and therefore, as you try and make mistakes and fix them, you begin to try different types of structures for different divisions, departments, and those kinds of things. And eventually, you will, with continued success, hopefully reach a maturity phase where your company has grown in size, you've grown in market share, you've grown along financial capacity and capital reserves and all those kinds of things. So now you are a well-managed, well-run, all grown-up company. Professional management, quality assurance, good to great systems, great efficiency, and those kinds of things lead to, as you see the last bullet point in that phase, very few real surprises. You are on top of your game, and that may go for an extended period of time. And quite frankly, with some companies, you see that as they continue to introduce great products, one after the other, I think especially, for instance, in terms of the Apple Corporation, right? Home run after home run after home run, then they continue to enjoy this maturity phase. This may go on for a little while. But eventually, a company will typically enter a decline phase if there's no revival, if there's no way to breathe life into the company. It may reach a decline phase where, quite frankly, purposes begin to get blurred and your values compromised. Your leaders are aging or retiring or dying, and therefore new leaders are coming in. Things are beginning to get a little confused. Your systems tend towards bureaucracy, unnecessary layers of management and approval necessary. And you begin to really sense that there's a smell of decay and death in the room. And as you can see there, you look at the upper shoulders of this diagram, right? The growth phase and the danger zone. The danger zone leads to death if you don't do something about it. And as you might guess, each of these phases, right? Each of these phases of a company really suggests a fresh look at organizational structure. The organizational structure that you may want to have in place once your company has hit the decline phase and needs a revival may be significantly different than the type of organizational structure you use during the birth and growth phases, when maybe perhaps you were using a very flat, decentralized kind of a structure because, quite frankly, you're just flying by the seat of your pants, right? Things are different in each one of these phases, and that's one of the major considerations that maybe you may have to shake things up later in your organizational life cycle. Now, what are some other factors affecting your choice of organizational structure? The type of strategy you're trying to bring to the marketplace, and how well is it aligned with the external environment. As you can see there, the second bullet point, different structures respond in different ways to various levels of environmental munificence and scarcity. We'll talk about that in just a second. You may not be familiar with that term. And turbulence or stability. And then finally, what technology is available to you and what you put in place also influences what makes the most sense in terms of an outside structure. Now, let's talk a little bit about what is this munificence thing. Munificence versus scarcity. And what we're really talking about is if you use this 2x2 matrix to consider, okay, what is the sense of the firm in its environment? Are you finding that resources are scarce and that you're struggling to address how to meet the resource needs in your marketplace? Or do you have a lot of resources and free access to those kinds of things? It's easy for you to deploy resources and capital. That's really what we mean by munificence. More on that in the textbook. Okay? But then also the other consideration of the external environment, are things relatively stable or are things relatively turbulent, changing, dynamic, unpredictable? And you can see here what this figure 8.14 from your textbook suggests is that different combinations of stability, turbulence versus munificence, scarcity will suggest different types of organizational structure, whether we're talking about very mechanistic or very organic, right? Or very functional or very multi-divisional, that will really have some impact on the efficiency of the organization and its ability to address its external environment. More on that in the text. You want to take a look at that, all right? And then finally, what are we talking about when we mentioned different coordinating mechanisms? Well, what we mean are the kinds of tools that you can use to reduce the disadvantages of any particular organizational structure that you might choose. And you can see some of the major tools or agents of coordination listed there. The organizational hierarchy itself, different rules and procedures which are dictated and then disseminated out to staff, committees, task forces, liaison personnel. I got to tell you, what we're really talking about on this slide is your choice of organizational structure will practically in the real world be better if you are better at enforcing clear lines of transparency and communication. Quite frankly, the source of most organizational structure problems is problems in communication. And quite frankly, if you become the kind of organization that you misunderstand someone in another department and then you think the worst of them and then you fire off 5 emails, well, you're going to have some major problems. You're going to have some major problems no matter what organizational structure design you choose. But if you can maintain clear lines of transparency and communication, generally giving people the benefit of the doubt when you misunderstand them, then your choice of organizational structure will work for you more often than not. That's really, I think, what the spirit of this whole idea of coordinating mechanisms really rests upon. So let's talk about some typical archetypes or examples of the types of structures that real-life contemporary organizations end up using. Number one is the simple structure. Simple structure, you can see it right there. Few departments, they're arranged by function, they're headed by the owner, very few technical support staff. And of course, that is a fast-moving young company with, quite frankly, not a whole lot of complexity, maybe not a whole lot of employees, and therefore you can get away with a simple structure, right? It's relatively self-explanatory. Whereas on the other side of things, you see the second example, the machine bureaucracy, highly structured, a formal organization that runs like a machine based upon its existing written procedures and rules. Procedures and rules, procedures and rules. You might think of a machine bureaucracy a lot like perhaps the U.S. military, all right? Lots of procedures and rules, highly structured, formal organization. Now, another type of bureaucracy, you see there, the professional bureaucracy. An organization, it has a functional structure. It's not huge. It's a medium-sized company, and it works best in stable environments, but has a primarily professional employee structure. What does that mean? Well, think of, for instance, a law corporation, right, where the majority of the employees are professionals. They're attorneys, and therefore it does have a functional structure with support staff, but generally it's a medium-sized, dynamic, adroit, working in a relatively stable environment where, quite frankly, in that situation, revenue is based upon billable hours. So that's the third example of a structural type. And then on this next slide, we'll talk about the other two. You see here, the divisionalized form, a multi-divisional structure or a hybrid. Typically very, very large corporations that have hybrid structure. And we've seen examples of that in the previous lecture. And I gave you some diagrams on that, on the hybrid structure. that's in the textbook in the previous lecture. That's an example of very, very large, perhaps multinational corporation that has different geographics, different geographical divisions that may run in different structural forms. Then the fifth example of a structural type, as you see there, the adhocracy. It's centralized, but it's informal. It's a complex organization that tries to stay adroit and flexible in the face of really rapid environmental change. And these are typically highly technical companies, companies that try to use a matrix or network structure to provide lots and lots of different options in terms of how the organizational structure can change and adapt to a rapidly changing marketplace. What we haven't said much about in this module to date is that while there are some large companies that have tried the matrix or ad hoc type of structure, there have been very few real successes. It's great on paper to say we're going to remain incredibly dynamic and morphable, but to make that work with actual organizations is very, very difficult, fraught with danger. And so the last bullet point, as we talk about these 5 archetypes and really just examples of ways you can try to align with the external environment, is that organizational structures change almost continually. Well, I'm not sure I really typically agree with that bullet point. What I've seen anecdotally in my own career is that there are always pressures on the existing organizational structure to change and adapt. It really depends upon the comfort level of executive leadership, whether to respond to those pressures or whether to dig in your heels and say, we're not changing, we're keeping things the way they are, even if they begin to work at cross purposes with the staff. Now, we've reproduced from the textbook here, table 8.3 as an example and a few descriptions for each of these 5 structural archetypes. I'm not going to read this slide at you. You can take a look at this and the textbook at your leisure. Just some examples so you can sort of have in mind what really is the difference between an adhocracy and a professional bureaucracy and those kinds of things. So please review that in the textbook as well. But this will provide you some sense of the different ways that companies choose to impose organizational structure upon their companies in a particular contextual environment. And so we hope this helps. We hope this, as you see here and at the beginning of this lecture, we hope that now you can sort of summarize and look at the contingency factors that influence the choice of a formal structure that's best for the organization. That you can talk about the coordinating mechanisms to support organizational structure, whatever you choose, and finally that you're able to get a sense of these 5 organizational archetypes that we're talking about in this chapter. Well, this is, as I said, our very last video in module number 8. You have been looking at now 8 videos on the topic of organizational structure and the importance of it and how you select it depending on your organization, depending on your organization's needs, goals, mission, vision, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, the people you have in the organization. Now, what I want to tell you, as we sort of tried to emphasize in the very first video, right, is that organizational structure is an crucially important decision that executive leadership needs to make, because the structure you select and put in place can either work with your people, with your resources, with your strategy to really exemplify the very best of efficiency in the marketplace, or the wrong choice of structure can be the cause of all sorts of headaches, problems, and work at cross purposes with your people trying to do the very best they can with what you've given them. And at the end of the day, as we've mentioned, the choice of organizational structure is really a way to get the best from your people. The crucial thing is that people work within an organizational structure, not that they work for the structure. The structure needs to work for them. So I hope this is helpful. I hope that this module has given you a little bit of a sense of why organization is indeed one of the 4 primary functions of what management does. We'll continue on at our look at management as we see you in the next module.